Hello, I am Stephen, and welcome to The World According to Stephen. This is the first episode of what I'm thinking will be a series called How They Got It Wrong. In this episode, I'll be talking about diplomatic immunity and to a smaller degree about a related concept, extraterritoriality. Diplomatic immunity is a subject often portrayed inaccurately in movies and films. It does exist, but its properties are often misrepresented. In case you're not familiar with it, diplomatic immunity is the concept that diplomats of a sending country, say for example the United States of America, are immune from arrest and criminal prosecution by the police and courts in the host country they are stationed in, say for example the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Now, the Hollywood version of diplomatic immunity is often to make it endure forever, no matter what the diplomat has done, and enable the diplomat to be a serial killer or run a cocaine importation ring and order hits on informants for months on end without consequence. In fact, there are a number of ways this would tend not to happen. It tends to royally piss off the host country if the diplomat is doing something like that, and it tends to also embarrass the sending country. Gee, who'd have thunk it? The host country has two main recourses if a diplomat is behaving offensively. One is to declare him or her persona non grata, not welcome and required to leave within a reasonable period of time, allowed for under the Vienna Conventions, which govern diplomatic relations and affairs. Persona non grata is, of course, initialized PNG. Thus, declaring someone to have this status is sometimes called pinging them. Now, if the sending country fails to recall the offending diplomat once they have been pinged, and they refuse to leave on their own, then once the grace period is up, guess what? The host country doesn't have to treat them as an accredited diplomat anymore and can freely arrest and prosecute them. Of course, given that persona non grata only applies to that particular host country, a pinged diplomat could either be recalled back home or sent on a posting to a different host country. Now, pinging someone for minor or trumped-up sort of reasons is, of course, offensive and tends to lead to retaliation. Also, pinging someone for just reasons, but when done to a dishonest, corrupt, authoritarian regime, such as Putinist Russia, also tends to lead to unjust crybaby retaliation, pretending that the original pinging was unjust. Because, of course, a regime like that can never admit to wrongdoing by its diplomats. It would lose face. The other course of action, only practical in cases where the sending country values its relationship with the host country and is likely to agree that the actions of the offending diplomat are highly reprehensible, is to get the sending country to withdraw its accreditation or recognition of the offending diplomat as one of its official representatives. That's right, you can get a sending country to disavow one of its representatives if he's been a really bad boy and they find it embarrassing enough. This is because diplomatic immunity is not some kind of magic shield a person can own permanently on their own, but a customary courtesy extended by one country or government to the official representatives of another, with which it has diplomatic relations. In a related area, movies and TV sometimes show diplomatic immunity as being permanently and directly confirmed by diplomatic ID, and suggest that this is in all cases accepted prima facie. You just show it and that's it. This is not quite correct. A valid diplomatic ID or credential is a sign that this person is, or perhaps until very recently was, right, you have to look at these things carefully, an accredited representative of a recognized government with which one's own government maintains relations. Now, in many cases, as a further courtesy, notice, as a courtesy, this is accepted at face value when a confrontation with the police or other agency occurs. However, if the police have doubts or believe the document is fake, they could still detain the supposed diplomat and inquire of the sending country and so on. Now, in most cases, of course, confirmation would soon arrive that this person is, in fact, an official representative of the sending country. If this is done in cases where the ID is hard to counterfeit, the representative is well known and recognizable, perhaps, for example, an ambassador who's actually maybe been on TV, etc., it would probably be viewed as harassment, especially if repeated, and could damage relations and lead to disciplinary action towards those law enforcement officers or whoever's responsible. But it is an option. It is an option more likely than one might think to be exercised, given that beat-level constables are not necessarily the best and brightest intellectually in all countries, and may or may not be familiar with diplomatic community and its fine points, until a higher-up frantically tells their sergeant to release the very important person they have mistakenly, foolishly arrested. Also, of course, as demonstrated directly in Lethal Weapon 2, which otherwise seems to ignore the possibilities of asking the State Department to, as mentioned, PNG, the evil South African diplomat, played, of course, convincingly by Joss Ackland, or asking South Africa to disavow him, given he's a drug smuggler and a murderer. Diplomatic immunity does not prevent the police from defending themselves. Nor, as one must acknowledge these days, is it a perfect magic shield against police brutality, falsification of evidence, and outright murder, sanctioned by qualified immunity and the blue wall of silence. The latter becomes rather more likely if the individual in question was perceived as a serious problem, had themselves killed cops, or was thought to have by the other cops, right? Begin to see how this is a more likely probability. Another possibility that people tend to ignore. Now, a related concept to diplomatic immunity, which attaches primarily to persons, is extraterritoriality, which attaches primarily to properties or premises, such as a building, a property, a house, a lot. Extraterritoriality is the concept that a country's embassy is treated as if it were that country's soil, not that of the host country. So in other words, that again, let's say, for example, the United States Embassy in London is treated as American soil rather than British soil. Now, there are limits, particularly for fire and health codes. Also, a point often misrepresented, only embassies and ambassadorial residences, that is, residence of the actual ambassador, when that residence is not part of the embassy grounds themselves, only those are extraterritorial. Embassies and ambassadorial residences. A consulate of any kind is not extraterritorial. Now, this concept, unfortunately, is egregiously misrepresented in a certain episode of Nash Bridges. Actually, not only extraterritoriality, but as we'll see, there's also some issues with diplomatic immunity and related things. So in this particular episode, Nash, and if you're not familiar with the show, so there's Nash Bridges is played by Don Johnson. He's kind of the title character, lead inspector, later lieutenant, captain, and of the Special Investigations Unit of the San Francisco Police Department. His partner is Joe Dominguez, played by Cheech Marin. So in this episode, they're chasing the perpetrators of a serious crime, and they come up on the premises of a British consulate. Not an embassy, consulate. Remember, they're in San Francisco. Now, all of a sudden, British Royal Marines, by implication, otherwise they would have to be a security firm that's very bold about obstructing justice and threatening police officers, suddenly pop out from behind this concrete barrier and point assault rifles at them. Now, off-screen, by implication, the Royal Marines illegally detain them. These are foreign soldiers illegally taking prisoner, which some would consider an act of war, peace officers in the performance of their duties. They then return their weapons and ID and let them go, followed by a polite on-screen apology by the consul. Now, given, again, that the consulate is not extraterritorial, the actions of these Royal Marines and their presence with fully automatic rifles are highly illegal. It is not their job or place to enforce anyone's diplomatic immunity in a foreign country that is not theirs, the United States. Those weapons they're carrying are not legal in the United States for a private citizen, whether or not they're a security contractor, member of another nation's military, or whatever else, to own. They're not peace officers. And they're not U.S. soldiers. They're also not, say, for example, on a joint exercise with U.S. troops on a U.S. base, which would be a different kind of situation, right? Also, their presence in force could be considered an invasion of the U.S., if not previously sanctioned by the U.S. government, which it doesn't seem to be. What would happen in real life, unlike the demented imagination of these particular writers and producers, is that Nash and Joe would return with an SFPD SWAT team and probably heavily armed FBI and ATF agents in a joint task force and arrest those British Royal Marines. The Royal Marines would be charged with obstruction of justice, false imprisonment, and pointing a weapon at a peace officer in a rude or threatening manner. Any that resisted arrest with lethal force using their assault rifles and survived the fire of the FBI, ATF, and SWAT team would face appropriate additional charges. Nash and Joe and the SIU would then, after that was over, the arrests and possible firefight, would then search the consulate, which is U.S. and not British soil, for evidence related to those charges and the original crime they were investigating at the beginning of the episode. Only the consuls themselves and their personal property would be covered by diplomatic immunity, also slightly more limited in the case of consular officers compared to other diplomats. However, as the episode later does get right, which is strange considering how wrong it's been up to that point, with sufficient leverage, Nash could probably get the British to disavow the criminal consul, who is in fact that guy who apologizes to them after illegally detaining them. He is in fact behind the whole criminal conspiracy that's the plot of the episode. He could probably get them to disavow him, allowing his arrest, detention, and arraignment on all relevant charges, which is in fact what actually happens toward the end of the episode. So, that's been a look at a couple of prime examples of ways that Hollywood messes up diplomatic immunity and extraterritoriality. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know.